On the black volcanic sand of the Pacific, a young Marine reached down toward a fallen Japanese officer. Beside the body lay a sword, curved, dark, beautiful, the kind of trophy men wrote home about, the kind that got passed around a squad and photographed and dreamed over. He never got to lift it. By 1944, a warning had spread through nearly every unit fighting across the Pacific Islands. Do not pick up the sword, do not touch the flag, do not roll the body, leave the trophies where they lie. To the men hearing it for the first time, it sounded like caution. It was not. The warning did not exist because the swords were fragile. It did not exist because command wanted to protect the enemy's honor. It existed because too many young Americans had already died reaching for something that looked like a prize and turned out to be the last thing they ever touched. This is the story of how the most wanted souvenir of the Pacific War became one of the deadliest objects on the battlefield. It is a story about fear, about an enemy who did not surrender the way other armies surrendered, and about the moment American troops learned a lesson that would harden into policy. On these islands, even the dead could still kill you. To understand why that warning spread, and why grown men learned to walk past the exact trophy they had crossed an ocean to find, you have to understand the war that produced it. The Pacific was not the war people pictured when they thought of the fighting in Europe. In France and Germany, armies advanced and retreated. Cities changed hands, and when a position became hopeless, soldiers often raised their hands and became prisoners. Surrender was terrible, but it was understood. It followed rules that both sides mostly recognized. The islands did not work that way. On places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the fighting happened in jungle, in coral, in caves, and in ruined ground where the two sides were sometimes only yards apart. There was nowhere to fall back to. The ocean was behind everyone, and on the other side of the line was an enemy who had been taught, through training and through a code drilled deep into the ranks, that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Many Japanese soldiers genuinely believed that to be captured was worse than death. That belief shaped everything. It meant that a Japanese position rarely gave up when it was surrounded. It meant that men fought until they were killed and sometimes chose to die on their own terms rather than be taken. It produced the desperate mass attacks the Americans came to call banzai charges, where soldiers with almost no chance of success threw themselves forward anyway. And it produced something quieter and more dangerous. If a soldier was willing to die rather than surrender, then a soldier who appeared to be dead, or wounded, or even trying to give up, could not be trusted the way a European prisoner could. The line between a corpse and a threat became terrifyingly thin. Into that world came the American souvenir hunt. Every army in that war collected trophies. It was almost universal. Young men far from home, surrounded by death, reached for objects that proved they had been there and survived. They took helmets, flags, pistols, rifles, personal effects. The Japanese good luck flags, covered in handwritten characters from a soldier's family and village, were carried home by the thousands. But nothing was wanted like the sword. The Japanese officer's sword was unlike anything the Americans carried. Officers and some senior enlisted men wore them as a mark of rank and tradition. Many were the standardized military swords issued during the war, the type known as the gunto. Others were far older, real family blades, some generations old, forged long before anyone alive had been born, had been fitted into military mounts and carried into battle by officers who came from families that had owned them for centuries. To an American teenager from Ohio or Texas, that sword was the single most powerful object he could bring home. It was proof of victory over a specific enemy. It had weight and history and menace. It was the trophy that ended all other trophies. Men made deals over swords they had not even found yet. They promised them to brothers and fathers. They risked a great deal to get one. The Japanese knew this, and that knowledge would be turned into a weapon. The first deaths came the way these things always come, quietly and then all at once. According to accounts from the island campaigns, it often began with a scene that looked like a gift. A patrol would move through a position that had just been overrun. The fighting there was over. Bodies lay where they had fallen, and near one of them, in plain view, was a sword. A Marine would kneel, he would reach for the handle, or he would take hold of the body to turn it over and get at the belt. And in that instant, the ground would erupt. Beneath the body, or beneath the sword itself, a grenade had been placed with its safety held down only by the weight resting on top of it. The moment that weight was lifted, the moment the trophy was pulled free, or the corpse was rolled, the device was released. There was no warning. There was rarely time to react. The soldier reaching for the prize took the blast at close range. Sometimes he was killed outright. Sometimes he lost a hand, an arm, his eyes, his face. And the men around him, the ones who had been leaning in to see the trophy their friend had found, were caught in it too. That was the terrible efficiency of it. The sword did not just kill the man who reached for it, it killed the small crowd that gathered around anyone lucky enough to find one. The survivors carried that image with them for the rest of their lives. One moment a friend was grinning over the best souvenir any of them had seen. The next moment there was nothing left to grin about. And the sword, in many cases, was still lying there, barely scratched, waiting for the next man who did not know better. The first reports of this were sometimes dismissed. A tragic accident, a careless man. Bad luck in a place made of bad luck. The second reports were not dismissed, because it was not one incident. It was a method, and once the men in the field understood that, everything about how they moved through a captured position changed. The trap under the trophy was only the beginning. As the campaigns ground on, American troops learned that almost nothing on that battlefield could be taken at face value. The wounded could not be trusted. A Japanese soldier lying injured, apparently helpless, might be waiting with a live grenade held against his own body, ready to pull the pin the moment an American came close enough to take with him. Men who tried to offer water or take a prisoner sometimes died for it. This was not universal, and there were real surrenders, real prisoners, real mercy shown on both sides. But it happened often enough that it rewrote the rules of caution. A helping hand extended toward an enemy became a gamble with a man's life. The dead could not be trusted either. Soldiers learned that a body might not be a body. A man could lie perfectly still among the fallen, wait for a patrol to pass, and then rise up behind them. So a grim practice spread through the ranks. Troops would fire again into bodies they passed, or bayonet them simply to be sure. It was brutal, and it disturbed the men who did it. But it came from a lesson written in blood. The alternative was a knife in your back from a corpse that had been watching you the whole time, and the objects could not be trusted. Flags were rigged, equipment was rigged. Abandoned positions and dugouts, the kind of place a tired man might duck into for cover or shelter, were sometimes prepared with hidden charges. A helmet turned upside down, a radio, a case, a rifle left leaning against a wall. Any of it could be the visible part of something waiting underneath. The sword sat at the center of all of it, because the sword was the thing men most wanted to grab without thinking. The warning moved faster than any official document ever could. It moved the way real warnings move in a war, from the mouth of a man who had seen it happen to the ears of every replacement who arrived green and eager and hungry for a trophy. Veterans grabbed new men by the collar and told them plainly, "Do not touch the swords, do not roll the bodies. If you see a prize just sitting there in the open, ask yourself why it is still there and why no one before you has taken it." By then, the warning had become more than advice. In unit after unit, it hardened into a standing instruction, enforced by sergeants who had already buried friends over a piece of curved steel. Leave the trophies alone. That was the order, and the men who ignored it were gambling with more than their own lives. If these buried stories from the Pacific War are the kind of history you want to actually understand, and not just hear once and forget, take a second to subscribe. Untold War Archives brings one of these forgotten accounts to light every week. Now, to see why a simple souvenir could turn an entire army cautious, you have to look past the single grenade under the single body. The reason the warning spread so far and stuck so hard is that the danger came from several directions at once. There was not one reason to fear the sword. There were four. And together they explain everything. The first reason was the most obvious. It was practical. The Japanese had learned to turn the American souvenir hunt into a delivery system for their own weapons. They understood that a curved blade lying in the open was almost irresistible, and that an enemy reaching for it would lower his guard completely. So they used the trophy as the trigger. The prize and the trap became the same object. It cost them almost nothing, and it thinned out the men who came after them without a single defender left alive to fire a shot. A dead soldier could still take an enemy with him if the enemy was greedy enough to bend down. The second reason went deeper into the mind of the enemy the Americans were facing. Because so many Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, the usual signals of safety no longer meant anything. In most wars, a still body was a safe body and a raised hand was a promise. Here, neither could be relied on. A man could be genuinely dead, or he could be waiting. A sword beside a fallen officer might mean the officer was finished, or it might mean he was lying in wait for someone to come collect his blade so he could take one last enemy into death with him. The Americans could not tell the difference from a distance, so they had to treat every version of the scene as the dangerous one. The refusal to surrender did not just make the fighting harder, it poisoned the ground afterward and made even victory feel unsafe. The third reason was quieter and colder. In some cases, the sword was not merely booby-trapped where it happened to fall, it was placed, left deliberately in the open as a lure. A blade positioned in a doorway, on a path, in the mouth of a cave, at a spot where an advancing patrol would have to pass and where a tired, excited young man might not be able to resist. The trophy became a fishing line. The Japanese understood their enemy's weakness with unsettling precision, and they used the sword to draw men into exactly the place they wanted them. The fourth reason was the most powerful of all, and it had nothing to do with the blast itself. It was psychological. Once the men knew what a sword could do, they could never look at one the same way again. The single most wanted object in the entire Pacific was now something to fear, and that fear followed them everywhere, into every captured position, over every body, past every glittering prize left lying in the sun. The enemy had managed to turn the Americans' own desire against them. The thing the men wanted most had become the thing they had to force themselves to walk past. A soldier who has to fight his own instincts every time he moves through a battlefield is a soldier who is already carrying an extra weight. That weight was the real payload of the trap. Put those four reasons together, and the warning stops sounding strange. The sword was practical to weaponize, impossible to trust, easy to use as a lure, and devastating to the mind. Of course, the order was to leave it. The only surprising thing is how many men still could not bring themselves to obey. Because here is the part that makes this story more than a lesson in caution. The order was hard to follow, and the reason it was hard reveals something painful about the men fighting this war. These were, in many cases, very young men. They had crossed the entire Pacific. They had watched friends die on the sand and in the surf. They had lived for weeks in conditions that broke minds and bodies. And in the middle of all that horror, the sword offered something almost impossible to resist. It was proof that they had survived. It was a piece of the war they could hold and one day carry home and set on a shelf and use to say without words, "I was there and I made it back." So men kept reaching, even after the warnings, even after they had seen what happened. The pull of the trophy was strong enough to override the fear, and the enemy had understood that about them from the start. The cost of that pull was written across the hospital ships and the graves, Marines who lost hands that would never grow back, men blinded, disfigured, killed at the exact moment they thought the danger had passed. There is a particular cruelty in dying, not in the firefight, but afterward, in the quiet, reaching for a keepsake. It robbed the death of even the dignity of combat. And the trap did something else to the men who survived it. It hardened them. Every soldier who watched a friend die over a sword came away trusting the enemy a little less, and hating the war a little more. The reluctance to take prisoners grew out of exactly this soil. When a wounded man might be a bomb, and a corpse might be an ambush, and a trophy might be a trigger, mercy starts to feel like a fatal mistake. Some men stopped offering it. The feigned surrenders and the hidden grenades created a spiral, where American caution turned to ruthlessness, and that ruthlessness made the Japanese even more certain that surrender meant death, which made them fight even harder to the end. Each side taught the other to be crueler. It is worth being honest about how far that went, because the record is honest about it. The souvenir hunt in the Pacific had a dark underside that historians have documented and that veterans themselves later described with discomfort. In some cases, the collecting did not stop at swords and flags. Bodies were searched, and worse. There were instances of men taking pieces of the dead as trophies. These acts were condemned by commanders and are remembered now as one of the ugliest expressions of how thoroughly the war had dehumanized the enemy in the eyes of the men fighting him. This did not happen because the Americans were uniquely cruel. It happened because a certain kind of war, fought against an enemy who would not surrender on islands where the dead could kill you, ground down the ordinary limits that keep men human. The sword trap was one small part of a much larger machine that turned decent young men into people they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. And on the other side of that machine were the prisoners who did surrender, and the wounded who were genuinely helpless, and the civilians caught in between. They paid for the atmosphere of suspicion the traps had created. When every still figure might be a threat, the innocent still ones suffered along with the dangerous ones. That is the quiet arithmetic of a battlefield poisoned by fear. The people who deserved mercy the most were often the ones least likely to receive it, because no one could afford to find out which kind of person they were dealing with. When the war finally ended in 1945, the swords came out of hiding by the hundreds of thousands. With the surrender of Japan, officers were required to give up their blades, and enormous numbers of them were collected, catalogued, stacked, and shipped. Many were the mass-produced wartime gunto, but among them were those old family blades, some of them true works of the swordmaker's art, centuries old that had been carried into a war that was never theirs. A great many were lost forever in the chaos, separated from families who had owned them for generations, scattered across the world in the trunks and attics of the men who took them home. There is a strange final irony in that. The sword had always been, in Japanese tradition, a symbol of honor and of the soul of the warrior who carried it. By the end, on those islands, it had become something else entirely. It had become a lure and a trap and a source of dread. And then, in surrender, it became a symbol one more time. The handing over of the sword was the oldest gesture of defeat there was. The very object that had killed so many Americans reaching for it in triumph now passed, quietly and by the thousands, into the hands of the men who had learned to fear it. So what does the warning actually tell us in the end? It tells us that the order to leave the swords was never really about swords. It was about an entire war compressed into a single object. In that curved blade lying in the sun was the enemy's refusal to surrender, the American hunger for a trophy, the collapse of trust between two sides who had stopped seeing each other as human, and the terrible creativity of men who had learned to weaponize their opponent's own desires. The men who fought there were told to walk past the one thing they wanted most, because their commanders had learned, at the cost of too many lives, that wanting it could get them killed. It is a small order, 4 or 5 words spoken by a tired sergeant. Do not touch the swords. But behind those words sat the whole grim logic of the Pacific War. The sword was remembered not because it saved lives, but because of what it revealed. On those islands, fear had stopped being a feeling. It had become a rule. And the men who survived carried that rule home along with the trophies and understood, for the rest of their lives, exactly what it had cost to learn it.